planning. So there will be opportunities in the future if folks want to do that, but we also hope that you can just kind of get thinking on your own as well about like what it might look like to develop a climate plan for your farm and to work with people in your community to develop sort of community scale plans as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. And my name is Nick Olson, and I work with Land Stewardship Project, and very happy to be here with everyone. Natalie and Annalie and I facilitated the 5-part series that we're going to be sharing, so we were a part of that as well. So very excited to be able to share that with you. And I think what Natalie said is the most important part. We're not here to sell a process or anything like that, but what we want to is we want you to hear from farmers who are thinking about climate change from a holistic standpoint and some of the things that they're thinking about on their farms to mitigate those risks and find new opportunities. And we're hoping that from that, you can be inspired. And we're also recognizing, a lot of us, that climate resiliency is also very tied into the social connectivity that we all have, both as farmers, but also within our communities. So this is a part of that resiliency too, is this ability to come together as a group of farmers and growers and supporters of farmers to really figure out ways to tackle some of this from the social elements as well. So really happy to have you here tonight. Annalie is providing tech support for us. So thank you, Annalie, for doing that tonight. And with that, we have a couple slides that Natalie and I would like to share with you. So if you want to cue those up, Annalie, that'd be great. Awesome. So just real briefly, when we decided to get a group of farmers together to talk about climate resiliency, it was really important for us at Land Stewardship Project to really hone in on this idea of whole farm management. So for some of you out in the Zoom crowd that have taken Farm Beginnings or been involved with any other LSP trainings, we really lean into this idea of whole farm planning. We've been doing that for the past 25 plus years. It continues to be kind of the cornerstone that we hear back from farmers that have worked with us, who have gotten started using some of our programs, that it's really what kind of set the tone for them to really think more broadly about their farm and to really incorporate not just the farm, but other elements of their life and other elements of their values into what they wanted to be doing. So it was really important as we started to think about climate change, that we weren't just honing in specifically on production techniques, that we were looking broadly at what does it look like to approach climate change resilience through a whole farm planning lens. So I just want to give you a quick couple, for those of you that a lot of this will be review for some of you, but for those that are new to this, there's so many great resources out there, including the book that I highlighted over here in the photo. It's one of these books. It might even be available as a PDF, but if not, it's a couple, it's like less than $10 and you can order it from NOFA. So it's called Whole Farm Planning. It just does a really good overview of this process. So essentially, whole farm planning is looking at your farm as a whole. It's not looking at it solely as the money, solely as the carrots, solely as the tractors. It's looking at it as a whole. And one of the key components of whole farm planning is to create a holistic goal. And there's a big process that you can go through to create a holistic goal. But essentially what we have found is the most important part is it emphasizes overall quality of life. And it's really based on values. So thinking about your core values and how you identify those and how you hold those true as you go into farming, as you go into life, as you go into community, especially when things get hard, like we're experiencing with these dramatic shifts in weather with climate change, that we can kind of lean back on those values to really kind of hold that core piece. So that's a really big part of whole farm planning. Then there's also this idea of examining and assessing your resources. And the cool part about whole farm planning is oftentimes when you hear resources from a farming standpoint, you think of the land and maybe the infrastructure and so forth. And that's part of it. But whole farm planning also has you step back and think about yourself, your team, the personal pieces, also the social context. So what communities are you in? This would be part of a whole farm planning process, is this community that we're building even online during COVID times. And then also the natural resources and things as well. Then part of whole farm planning is coming up with short and long-term goals. Lastly is coming up with some decision-making strategies to help monitor you, to make sure that you're actually meeting your holistic goal. And that's been really key for farmers too, especially when things get hard, to be able to step back and say like, hey, is farming and the way that we're farming and how we're doing this still ringing true for our holistic goal, especially that quality of life piece? And we've had a lot of farmers talk really critically about that recently, about balancing that family time, balancing that personal time, as well as farming. And this idea of whole farm planning really helps folks come up with a framework to do that well. All right, Natalie, we can hop to the next slide. So for this particular process that we went through with a group of farmers around climate resiliency, we took the overall framework of whole farm planning. So we rooted it in this idea of having a really solid set of goals and ways to monitor that. And then we came up with this. We didn't come up with this. We worked with a facilitator named Laura Legnick out of upstate New York, who is a risk management educator and has been for many, many years. And she's adapted some risk management strategies to look at climate change, but from a whole farm planning perspective. And Laura did an amazing job of adapting some of these resources and giving us this idea of how we could kind of like look through that. So Laura walked us through a process, this group of farmers. We went through a 5-step process with Laura. And again, we're not saying that you have to go through that process to get to where these farmers got to, but we just wanted to share some of the things that these folks were thinking about as they went through the process. So the first thing was just an overall farm assessment. We utilized a SWOT, which a lot of small businesses do: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We also had folks kind of revisit their whole farm plan, which included their holistic goals. Then we went into this idea of exploring current and expected weather risk. Like, what is it going to look like in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa in the coming years? And actually, Natalie is going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And then which of those risks, those climate risks, those changes in weather patterns are you experiencing most directly on your farm? From there, we started to talk about how can we manage for some of those things. So what are the potential management strategies and practices to deal with these changes? And the cool part about this, again, from a whole farm planning standpoint, is it wasn't just production based. A lot of it was production based, but again, we were thinking about the financial pieces. We were thinking about the social pieces, both of our crews and ourselves within these things. We were thinking about our communities and what our communities are looking for as we face climate change. And then we went through and started to identify, well, what would be some of the best practices for our farms to address some of these strategies that we're seeing? Like, how could we address these weather conditions that all of you put into the chat earlier? And then with that, we had farmers select kind of the top couple practices that they wanted to focus on, and then make a plan to actually address those things very specifically, and also a plan to monitor that so that we could then circle back to that first slide of looking at, or that first category of what does it look like to actually monitor this from a whole farm perspective. So that's very quickly, but that's kind of the process and the thinking that the farmers were going through when creating this resiliency plan for their farms. And Natalie, I'll pass it over to you.
Right. So we're going to kind of use this same framework in a very sped up way tonight. So we're not going to do like a whole farm planning thing. What Nick shared is as much as we're going to share. That's a very individual thing for you to do. But we're going to walk through what some of those climate risks are, and then talk about what some of the solutions are. And then you're going to hear from the 3 farmers who are going to talk through those last 2 steps of kind of how they came up with the strategies that they came up with and narrowed it down. So I realized as people were trickling in that a lot of you are from Wisconsin, and I only included Minnesota maps here, but a lot of the same principles apply in Wisconsin. So this is just a super quick overview. The things that we know, I think something I always like to emphasize when we talk about climate change is that we live in a place with an extreme climate and we have really short memories. And so sometimes it feels like the thing that we most recently experienced, like a horrible drought, is what we're going to continue to experience, and it's only going to get worse. And so it's good to step back and look at more long-term trends to better understand what's coming, because what we experienced this last summer is probably not going to be the norm going forward. So what we do expect, the highest confidence level things that we expect, are that we're going to have higher temperature lows. So our winters are not as cold as they used to be. Those lows are getting higher and we're experiencing less of them. So that has implications for things like species overwintering here that didn't used to overwinter here for winter hardiness. We're also very confident that we are experiencing and will continue to experience more intense rainfall events. So really heavy storms where we're getting a lot of water at once. We have a pretty high confidence level that we're also going to experience longer, more intense heat waves and more days between rain. So we have this sort of weird situation that most of you are already seeing and recognized. You shared in the chat when you came in, where we're preparing for a future that both has too much water and not enough water. And often those things are co-occurring in the same season, even over a couple of weeks. Another thing that we don't talk about a lot, but I knew like many of the farmers who participated in this process were talking about stronger winds. And there is some evidence for that, that as we get more heat in our atmosphere, especially in the winter, that can lead to more tornadoes. So like we had tornadoes this winter in December, we've never had that before. Things like that will become more common, most likely, and also stronger windstorms. So those are the things that we're preparing for. And there is a little bit of nuance there. So these top two maps are about precipitation patterns. So I know they're really small, but that top left map looks at over the last 100 years or so. Most of the state of Minnesota is getting more rain, up to about 15% more rain compared to 100 years ago. But that pocket of far northern Minnesota is actually getting drier. And this map on the right is looking at the same thing, but on a more recent time scale. On the bottom, we're looking at temperature change. And it's worth noting that the further north you go, the more we're seeing those temperature changes, and they're not equal between summer and winter. So our winter temperatures are getting warmer, whereas the summer is not getting as warm. And that feels counterintuitive because we have these intense heat waves. But what we're seeing is by the end of the century, we can expect up to 30 more days above 90 degrees. So more hot days, but that hot temperature isn't necessarily getting hotter. So it's not like we're going from 100 degrees to 115 degrees, that sort of thing. It's just that we're having more hot days overall. And that, of course, has implications for our health and safety when we're out in the fields, for crop health, things like that. So that's the 2-minute overview of climate risks. And then this final slide before we turn it over to the farmers. And Nick alluded to some of this, but we want to think really broadly about climate strategies. Often when we talk about climate change, we get stuck on conversations about infrastructure, like, everyone just needs to build a well and build a bunch of high tunnels. And it's a lot broader than that. Our planning should be broader than that. So investing in natural systems, so things like soil health, crop rotation, water management, definitely like tending to the ecosystems around us. Also human, I think this is one that gets overlooked a lot, can be really important. So training your employees to handle disease management better. Skill development, making sure that you are investing in the safety of your workers with things like water breaks. We've talked about popsicle breaks, making sure there's shade around the farm for people, having people be paid well. And then social, investing in your broader community, relationships with neighbors. So many farmers in this process talked about not just vegetable farmer neighbors, but having relationships with conventional corn and soybean neighbors and not farming neighbors as well. In addition to that, financial planning. So making sure that you're aware of resources, incentive programs, insurance, grants, things that can help you with unexpected events, but also can help invest in some of those bigger investments like the physical and technical things like infrastructure, so high tunnels, wells, equipment, etc. So these are all the things that we're thinking about. And so the farmers went through this process of sort of writing down every single possible solution and then really narrowing it down to what is feasible. So with that, we are going to turn it over to 3 farmers. So we have Jody Lenz from Threshing Table Farm, Lauren from Dancing Gnome Farm, and my brain just blinked. That's the right name, right? And then Joan from Prairie Drifter Farm. And we're really excited to have all three of them present because they are all amazing and they're all at different stages of their careers, different stages of how long they've been on their farms. And so they all have some different and unique insights. And they're also geographically diverse. So even though we're not that far apart, the challenges that they're facing are a little bit distinct. So with that, I think we're going to have Jody present first, right? All right.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, my husband and I have Threshing Table Farm in Star Prairie, Wisconsin. We're about an hour east of the Twin Cities. We are vegetable CSA, and this year we are going from 200 to 300 shares. We've been at 200 for quite a while. Next slide, please. So we've been farming for about 15 years, and I think our farm has aged just as we have, a little haphazardly, but with a lot of fun. So that was my husband and kids when we first started. And the next picture was us this last summer. So we farm about 11 acres. 3 of those at any given time are in cover crop. And then as crops come off, we put in more cover crop as the season goes on. So at any time or by the end of the season, we have about 8 acres in cover crop. We have 1 hoop house. And as I mentioned, we farm, we have about 300 CSA shares. 95 of those go to local people, and then the rest goes to Taher Food Service for their chefs in the Twin Cities to use. We sell a very small amount to a local restaurant, when we have a small on-farm veggie stand, and then any of our extras are sold to a local food hub that supplies food pantries in Western Wisconsin. Next slide, please. We have a crew. Our crew is a mix of part-time and full-time people, and it's but together we have about 8 full-time positions, plus Mike and I, and this will be the first year that he will be on the farm full-time, not working an off-farm full-time job. Very excited about that. But during the fall, that labor cuts down to half, maybe a little bit less, just because we hire a lot of high school and college kids. So then they leave us, and there's just a smaller crew that carries on from there. So for us going through this process, resiliency is really about getting to do what we love as long as possible with the weather, the climate changes, our community's needs, and our own needs as they change. So all of the things that came out in our plan as kind of the focus items that we really want to work on were all things that have been bubbling up for a few years. And some of these things we had even started on, but the process helped us to look at the broad needs or the ideas and see how they fit in with our holistic goal and narrow down to several actions that we really felt like we could move forward with this year. It really helped us focus the why and the how. And I was able to move from being overwhelmed by all of the ideas and all of the needs to a fairly neat and tidy plan. So next slide, please. So here we'll talk about the 4 things I want to work on this year because of this process. The first one is community. So we have a pretty vibrant community around us of members as well as neighbors, something we've worked on, but we really want to build more into that. And one of my members had come to me this winter wanting to start a group that would meet on the farm, that would be about people that would come from farm membership to talk about topics like canning or fermenting or how to reduce carbon footprint, or a book study group, just kind of whatever. It would be member topics would come from members. They would maybe teach each other. So, and the fact that she wanted to take this on was super exciting to me. So it's certainly something that's been talked about for years. We're excited to see this actually happening. The other part of that community piece is that we're surrounded by corn, conventional corn and dairy farmers. And those neighbors have been extremely supportive of us, and we've helped each other out. But we often have varied discussions, often around sports and who knows what, but politics, and we don't all agree, but it's just a really good time for us to start having some very specific conversations around things that we're dealing with, around climate change that they are also, and trying to figure out some ways to build in some climate resiliency talk, around irrigation or around what if the power goes out, and how do we help each other out as neighbors. So that's the community part. The cows part is that there's my cows. I got 2 Dexter cows last fall. Our farm is only a total of about 18 acres. So I don't have room for a herd of really anything. But we wanted to get animals into the rotation out in our fields. We felt like that was much better for soil health. And so the answer, we feel, are these 2 small Dexter cows. And our plan is to do movable fencing out on our cover crops, rotate them through, and then when for harvesting the last of the broccoli or whatever, before we put the cover crops down, we'll let the cows in first. So that's part of our rotation. So I'm super excited about that, and they're super cute. So next slide, please. The other 2 things we have here, the first one is irrigation. So irrigation there's a picture of us moving our irrigation. It's not fun. And my husband had it, I think it was like 56 days in a row we moved irrigation without a break. And it's not enough. Our well wasn't pumping out enough. No matter how much we moved the irrigation, things weren't getting watered as well as they could have. So we've been working with NRCS over the winter to get a new system designed, and then we're putting in a pollinator habitat, which helps obviously with the pollinators, but it will also help us get some cost share for this irrigation project. So the plants will be watered more often, and the well will have more capacity, and our bodies will get a break. And then the last thing is the rhubarb. The first box or 2, sometimes 3, depending on the year. Last year was a tough beginning because it was so dry. They freak me out every year about, what's going to go in and will it be enough? And so we're working towards trying to figure out what can go in that first box that's not weather dependent. So rhubarb is one thing, because it doesn't seem to matter what the weather's doing, the rhubarb's there. So I'm expanding my rhubarb patch, but we're also working on growing popcorn and possibly some dried beans that we will hold over the winter so that those can go in those first boxes. And it's a really great time for us to share with our members a good communication piece in the newsletters to why they're getting those things and what we may have been dealing with in the spring and with climate change. So next slide, please. And then I just really like this picture from up above in our pack shed, but the next thing for us on the horizon, kind of the big topic is electricity, another form of getting electricity happening on our farm. So if there's a power outage, how do we still water? How do we still wash? How do we still cool? How do we do the things we need to, because we want to keep feeding our community, and we have all this produce, and to think that it could get stopped because we don't have electricity just is not okay. So we're trying, that's the next big thing to figure out as we move forward. But that's it.
All right, thanks so much, Jody. I think did we say we were gonna do Q&A a little bit with each farmer and then more at the end?
I think we're gonna open it up for like 1 or 2 questions. Yeah, and I'll stop sharing, I guess, while we're doing that, and then I can bring it back up.
All right, so any questions for Jody?
Thanks, Melissa. That is exciting.
What are you looking into for electric backup?
That was my question too.
Yeah, at this point, I hesitate to share because I don't know what I'm sharing, but there's a guy in our community that has been working on a windmill design that he's been working on for several years, and he's hoping this summer that they're going to hit like production on it. And everything he's told us about it, it sounds perfect for what we want, but I won't know until they've actually got it are to the point of production and can really tell me what it's looking like now compared to a couple of years ago. But if not that, then maybe solar. I don't know. We haven't really, this is the first time we're finally feeling like, okay, it's time to start really looking at this. So we have not dug in deep yet.
All right, should we move on to Lauren? And if you think of questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll come back to them.
All right, I'm Lauren Berry. I have a small certified organic vegetable farm. We're in Southeast Minnesota, in Wabasha, Minnesota. If you haven't made it down here, it's a really beautiful part of the state. We're in the driftless region right next to the Mississippi River. I started the farm in 2014, and in 2019, we had an opportunity to move the farm and start growing down here in Wabasha. And so that transition has been wonderful and also interesting, just seeing how different 2 different pieces of land can be. We grow around 6 acres of certified organic vegetables, and we market them through a 75-member CSA. So I bring boxes up to the Twin Cities, and then about 1/3 of our boxes are marketed here locally in Wabasha. I do 1 primary farmers market. So I go to the Hopkins Farmers Market. That's been my primary market since I started, through the move and all, and it's been a really great market for us. And then we are hoping to join our local Wabasha Farmers Market is back in person this year after a COVID hiatus. So we are hoping to participate in that as well. And my partner runs a kayak guiding business down here in Wabasha. So he's based on the Mississippi River, taking folks in the backwaters where the Chippewa River Delta meets the Mississippi. There's like these amazing back channels down here. So that was part of the reason for wanting to move the farm down to Wabasha so that our life could be a little more centrally located, which has been wonderful. And we hire a really awesome crew who work sort of both for Michael's business and on the farm. So they spend a couple days at Broken Paddle and a couple days with me. And that has worked out really well. They get a little more variety in their day-to-day, and they're all lovely, outdoorsy, engaged, interesting people. And it also helps us, Michael needs more staff on weekends. Like as an ecotourism business, like weekends are the primary time when he needs help. And so we can hire enough people so that he's fully staffed on the weekends, and then I can use them a little more throughout the week to get them up to full-time hours. So it's been a really nice balance for both of our businesses. So this process has been really interesting. I think before going through this cohort opportunity, climate change, like is something that's just sort of this looming nebulous threat that feels a little bit overwhelming and a little bit all-encompassing. Like there's just so many different ways that I can see it impacting the farm. So it's a lot. It feels really overwhelming, and there's it's hard to know even where to start. And so this process, I think a lot of times I end up feeling pretty reactionary, like, oh my gosh, there's a drought, like, I've got to figure out irrigation, and oh my God, just responding to the most immediate threat that's coming up. And so this process really helped me like take a step back and like look at the projections and just write it all down. And that has been really helpful, just to like take a breath and look at it in a more systematic way, which has been really helpful. There's no easy answers. There's no easy fixes to any of this, but it feels a little more manageable. It feels like I have thought through it and have some tools. So all in all, that's been a really positive thing. So as a good Farm Beginnings graduate, and I think we all probably do this at the end of the season, we like take in the data from the season and we run it through like our algorithms and use those algorithms to help us make decisions for the next year. And it's like a mixture of how the last season went, and we're running it through our holistic goal algorithms and our quality of life statements and our value statements and all of these different things that help inform how we make decisions. And acknowledging that we have limited time and limited money to implement these decisions. So like, obviously there's a million things that we would ideally love to do, but we're limited in what we can do. And so my approach in this process was really like trying to look at all the possible things that climate change could impact on the farm and like my limited pool of resources, and trying to figure out how I can like spread those resources to like fix or help mitigate some of the weakest links or some of the biggest risks. So that was just generally my framework. So basically this process to me was like adding new code to my decision-making algorithm. And in a lot of cases, I found that it actually bolstered some of the things that we are doing already. So I kind of think about the things that I put in my plan as like 3 different categories. So the first category for me was the low-hanging fruit. So this was something that is probably not that likely. So for me, it's like, if we were to have a power outage early in the spring, we could probably get our greenhouse working with a generator, but we wouldn't have water. Like we don't have a way currently to hook up water to our well pump. But we do happen to have on the farm like a big water storage cube from when we were going to try to use it to water the goats on the hillside, and hasn't worked out that way. But we have a big water cube. And so our low-hanging fruit with like minimal time and no money investment is to fill that water cube so that it's available. And if the power goes out early in the spring, we won't lose an entire season worth of transplants in the greenhouse. We'll be able to water them. So probably not as likely. It's not going to happen every year, but it could help mitigate like a really catastrophic event. So that was one easy fix for us. Then there were things that we're doing already, like based on our value statements and holistic goals and all of our existing decision-making framework, that also will help with climate change resilience. So for example, just like broad categories, but things like soil health, like where we have pretty sloped land and increasing like intense water events, we're worried about erosion. We're worried about water holding capacity, like ability to absorb and then retain water for us to help mitigate those ups and downs in terms of rain events. And so just basic soil health practices, which we want to do anyway for lots of other reasons, but it helps reinforce those decisions and helps bring those to the surface when we're allocating our time. And then, yeah, things also like looking at pests and diseases. And so like, I always have a goal to keep really good records of when I'm seeing pests and diseases, so it's something I want to do already, but I could get better at. And so being able to monitor those things, so working that into like a record keeping sheet that we already use and building it into my schedule so that I actually follow through with doing that. And then taking the next step and reaching out to the resources that are available to us, like wonderful extension people with lots of knowledge. So getting those relationships going is sort of a social, building that like social connection to have resilience as, you know, we anticipate like pest and disease pressures to change with climate over the next however many decades. So that's another example of something that I'm trying to do already, but could do better. So it takes maybe a little minimal effort, but could go a long way. And then things like continuing to trial new varieties, which I do every year, but I'm not as good at keeping track of how they're actually doing, which is less helpful. So per some advice from Joan, actually, who we'll hear, just building that into like my planting log. Like I have a custom designed planting log that I print out. So just having a section there where I can make notes about how the varieties are actually doing. So they're in that place. So then when I go to order seeds next year, I can make more informed decisions. And that just helps the farm feel more flexible. So some of the other themes that I'm thinking about when I'm trying to decide what to do is like, what gives me flexibility? What helps me like adapt to research, to changing conditions, because I know that things will continue to change as we go forward. So speaking to that unpredictability, like what gives me tools to be able to adapt. And then the third category that I was thinking about was like, how can I make those infrastructure changes, which often take a little more time and a little more money. And for me, like a little more just like brain work of figuring out new systems and figuring out how to incorporate them into what we're doing. So the two that I am looking at this year, one is like finessing our irrigation system. We have pretty heavy soils and haven't like needed to irrigate, but it's becoming increasingly clear that having that as an option will help give us that flexibility going forward. So it's not necessarily 100% urgent, but I have the time to like investigate some more irrigation systems and help build that system out. And then similarly, like working on like a prototype caterpillar tunnel, seeing how, you know, figuring out a design that works for us on our farm, figuring out how to manage them to help buffer field conditions. So it can be for like, I don't know, solanaceous crops or things under plastic, or maybe also doing some crops under shade cloth, but just kind of figuring out how that system will work on our farm.
Thank you, Lauren. Let's see, Annalie, do you want to stop? Beat me to it. Any initial, again, we are going to have a big Q&A after Joan, but any initial questions for Lauren?
Yeah, I see Lori's question here. I think that's a really interesting question. And like, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts on that too. I definitely am thinking about which crops do well for me. I haven't looked as much at perennials specifically, but I think that might be a reality that we start to think about that as well.
Yeah, Lori, I'm going to save that question and then roll it back in at the after John presents, and we can hear from all three farmers. I know Jody obviously shared a little bit about rhubarb, but that's a great question. Any other questions for Lauren? All right, thank you, Lauren, for sharing. Really appreciate it. And let's see, we have Joan Olson from Prairie Drifter Farm in Litchfield, across the house from me. Joan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and Annalie will share your slide.
Sounds good. In case the same last name was not obvious, Nick and I are partners and we do farm together. So we have Prairie Drifter Farm in Litchfield, Minnesota. We have a 33-acre farm. It's actually a fairly wet farm, which has been challenging for climate, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. We diversified vegetables. Our main market is CSA. We have 220 member CSA, but that translates to packing 150 boxes a week. We also have 2 co-op wholesale accounts, and we delivered to 2 food shelves. And then we just recently started doing a farm to school program. This coming season will be our 3rd season with farm to school. For employees, it's Nick and I, and then generally we hire 2 full-time employees and then would have just 1 part-time employee coming 1 day a week. And then about 4 or 5 work shares who come just half a day a week to help us out with CSA Pack. This year is going to look a little bit different. And actually the folks we're going to be trialing out some co-farming with, I think, are on this Zoom call right now. So we're pretty excited about that. So that our schedule is going to look a little bit different this year. And actually it's one of our responses to needing more resilience on the farm, which we didn't quite come around to that in this process, but that's definitely something we thought about, is the people on the farm are part of our resilience package for sure. And I like what Jody had said about what does resilience mean to us. And I think it definitely means the 2 big things are delivering a good quality product to our community and also doing it with joy. And I think some of our farming challenges, of whether it's just time or stress or anxiety, those definitely have paired really tightly with climate recently. And so we're recognizing those things have to happen in order for us to keep wanting to farm. And we do really want to keep wanting to farm as long as our bodies will allow us to. So, so this is our family on the top there. We have 2 kids, Abe and Freya. And as they get older, they become increasingly more and more part of the farm, which is really fun to see. Diversity and habitat are really important to us in the farm. So we spent a lot of time over the last several years increasing habitat and working with pollinators and beneficial insects on the farm. For climate resilience, we have 3 high tunnels now on the farm, and that's definitely been in response to climate, especially when it comes to tomatoes with disease. And having early season and late season crops protected as well from wind and hail and rain and frost and all the above. And then I have one of our past crews and Ashley, who is going to co-farm with us this year, is in that picture. The people we work with are just a hugely critical part of our farm. So that's something we are continuing to work with to grow and strengthen that. So just our experience with this process, I think Nick and I went into this with we talk about this all the time and we're constantly trying new things and we have all sorts of practices and, we kind of know the solutions, we've got it figured out. And I think this process really shook that up for us, which is super fantastic. It made us, again, step back, and you've heard this from Natalie and from Nick, but it made us step back and think about solutions, not just from a new farming practice or some new tool that we can buy, but it really forced us, because the process asked you for each thing you wanted to trial, you had to come up with 5 different solutions. So it wasn't just oh, you want to improve soil health? Well, reduce tillage. You also had to come up with a financial solution and a human solution and a natural solution. And being forced to do that actually allowed our creativity to come out a little bit more in terms of problem solving. I don't know if y'all are like this on your farms, but Nick and I, as we're managing together, tend to get in our silos, and we had the same conversations over and over, same problems, same solutions, let's just try it again. And then those things tend to not grow our resiliency more. And it was a neat process to go through this with a group of other farmers who are dealing with the same things, because we could bounce ideas off of each other, and you'd hear what another farmer is doing and say, oh, well, that would definitely work here, or at least we like to try it. I think it kind of made me think about being a scientist and knowing the answer that you want to be at the end, and then just making everything fit to that answer. And then you just stick with that answer, even though that answer isn't necessarily the one. Instead, we were forced to come at this in a process that was not familiar to me, and it was not comfortable. But by the time we got to the end, it was oh, okay, that was not the solution I thought was going to, lead us to more climate resilience, but here it is, and we're going to give this a go this year. So what led us to our solutions? First, I want to start with our biggest issues were excess moisture, variability in temperature, high temps, heat waves. The new one with the drought, which you recognize from what Natalie said, is not necessarily the norm, but it's out there. And then losing power during storms. Those are some things that came up. And through the process that Natalie and Nick talked about, we decided to implement 4 different strategies to attack some of those issues. One was kind of the obvious, we're going to sustain and improve soil health, because that solves so many things. But I'm going to say the 4 big ones that came up and then go into the practice. But a big one, so improve soil health. The second one was manage the farm as part of a larger social landscape. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. Our third is changing our infrastructure to match new conditions and also expected conditions that are coming up. And then finally, change our management to accommodate expected future conditions. So those are like the four really big, broad strategies that we decided we wanted to attack. And the reason I said those first is something that Laura Legnick talked about in the training was if you only think about like a practice that you want to try this year, if that practice doesn't work, then it's kind of like you're restarting the whole process. But like the big strategy, so for instance, one of the big strategies we really want to work on is improving soil health. And let's say that our practice we're going to try out is a new mulching system. Well, if that new mulching system doesn't work out and all that we're thinking about is this new mulching system, we forget that the original goal was soil health. And instead of like restarting the wheel, it's like, okay, soil health, let's dig back into that toolbox, that diverse toolbox that we came up with, and let's try something different. So the specific things we're talking about doing, and Nick and I have talked about this for some time, but have never really done it. And this year we're doing it. And it's to establish a 4-year rotation plan for the whole farm. And what we mean by that is like, not just planning what's going to be in this field this year, but also what's going to be there in years 2 and 3 and 4, and not just what vegetables are going to be in there, but what cover crops are going to be hopefully in there in years 2 and 3 and 4 at the beginning of the season, the end of the season. Not just, oh gosh, it's the 3rd year, we should do some soil tests. We're going to have within that 4-year rotation planning in where soil tests are going to happen. So our hope is that will give us just a broader look about creating a healthy soil system, but with intention and not so, like Lauren mentioned, and this is definitely true of our farm, just being reactionary. A specific example is, we'd have really a wet spring and we couldn't get into the field that we meant to have this certain crop in, and we need to move it. But then we'd think, oh, but next year, is that going to have carrots next year? Oh no, we can't move it there. Oh, we can't plant winter rye here in the spring because maybe, or in the fall, because maybe in the spring it's going to be this and it's going to be hard to incorporate. And so we tend to be kind of reactionary, and me in particular, because I'm a bit type A, would just like worry about all the little details and the structures. And instead of thinking about our fields and our farm as a whole, we're just thinking about it in parts and pieces. And that, it's gotten us this far. We started farming in 2010 and it's fine. We've always had good product, but it can definitely be better. And I think really working at this 4-year whole farm rotation will also bring down some of our anxiety and our stress and make our soil building processes more intentional and most likely also like work better on the farm. So that's a big one, is this 4-year rotation. And it looks super ugly. I have it on a big spreadsheet right now, but it's actually really fun to work through this with Nick. But that's the other thing in our farm. We tend to kind of work in silos. I do like the vegetable crop planting. Nick does more of the cover cropping, and we're working a lot more on having shared documents where we are more knowledgeable about the other person's silo. So it's less of a silo. And as I mentioned, we're going into this idea of co-farming, and we really realized like our information can't be stored just within our own selves and our own documents. We really have to be able to share it in a way that makes sense to everybody on the farm team and allows everyone on the farm to have more buy-in and just be more invested, and also just have more ability to bring all of our creative brains together. So the second thing I talked about was managing the farm as a larger social landscape. And one of the things that I recognize about my personality is I'm sort of a performance freak, and that I really want to make sure every box is awesome. And Jody, you talked about those early boxes and being stressed out. Like that is something I absolutely stress about. And I think, oh, we're going to disappoint our members. And what we realized is we really had to be more intentional to lean into the C of CSA and lean into the community. And one of the ways we can do that is the way in which we communicate with them. And instead of just, oh, it's, we have to do a newsletter every week, and oh gosh, it's March, I should probably send an update. We decided that this year we really want to create a communication plan that's laid out ahead of time. So in January, we do this. In February, we do this. In March, we do this. And then we have 18 weeks of CSA. So we have a spreadsheet set up with like, in week 1, here's our intention for that newsletter. In week 2, here's our intention for the newsletter. And not necessarily like exactly what we're going to write about, but just like big themes, so that we can remember to be writing about climate with our members, so that we can be educating our members about what's happening in the farm, and then not write about it every single week, because we don't want to be farmer complainers either, who are only just complaining about the weather and the climate and this is so hard. And like, again, that doesn't help us with this joy piece of our resiliency. So we really feel like this communication plan can like also almost plan in the joy for us. And like I said, we have an 8 and 11-year-old right now, and they're perfectly capable of writing newsletters. So they're absolutely going to be on our communication plan. So it's not just what we're going to write about and when, but also who's in charge. That tends to fall to me. And I'll admit that I definitely lose the joy of writing newsletters week after week after week. And I just like bang my head about what am I going to write about this week? And so I think it'll be great to have Abe and Freya, put their voice in there, and have more of our farm crew put their voice in there. So we can not just be educating our members about what's going on in the farm with weather and climate, but also just like the fun of it and allowing that to be more of a community piece. I think they'll know us better through that process as well. So then the other thing we talked about was altering this infrastructure to think about what could be future and expected conditions. We actually are lucky that we have a really good well, and it has good volume, and it is working up until now, but we're finding the need to adjust it and update it to make it more versatile for really wet times or really dry times. So a specific challenge we have is our well is on or not. And so we really want to have a way to have that well deliver less water if we need to. So like just being able to do drip in a very small portion of the farm instead of having to drip everything in the farm if we need to drip one thing. That's been a challenge with our well. So we're looking into, we have contacted a couple of companies to get quotes, and Natalie brought up to us that there is potentially some legislation about irrigation grant money for farmers. So we'll be ready for that if that comes around, which would be great. And then finally, Lauren talked about this too, but just this idea of record keeping and monitoring. We're actually pretty good record keepers. Like we do a pretty good job of that. But I think there's certain things we plan on record keeping, and we do really well. And there's certain things we think that we're keeping records on, and we get to November when we compiled out of our data, and it's like, no, I didn't write any of that down. It was all in my head. I just told myself in my head that this is how this crop did or how this variety is, but I didn't write it down. And it may or may not be very complete. So when I talked about that 4-year rotation plan of like knowing what's coming next year, year 3, year 4, we also want to do that with our monitoring plan. So putting on the calendar, this is an idea we heard from Natalie, actually, as a farm that she worked at, had this map of the farm with plexiglass over it. And every Friday, the crew would come together and write notes on it. And it was everybody. So in my case, it tends to be me, which is fine, but then I miss things. And if it's the whole crew coming together and sharing what we've noticed, whether it's pests, whether it's disease, whether it's things that are doing really well, or if Nick incorporated a cover crop, but it wasn't broken down enough before we seeded the carrots, like all that information, we're hoping to capture more of that. And then again, it's this idea of not having these silos of information within the farm, but sharing more as a crew. So beyond just that Friday check-in, we really wanted to have monitoring check-in about soil health. So like putting on our calendar, this is when we're going to do infiltration monitoring, or this is when we're going to be testing pH, or this is when we're going to be doing slake tests for aggregates. So that's all just on the calendar. So we're not forgetting or putting it off, or not remembering and not making it a priority. So there's obviously like questions that those are our 4 big things we want to work on. We feel like they're doable and measurable, and we can accomplish them this year. Big things that are still up and out there, power, just like Jody talked about, we're definitely looking into solar for the farm. It's not a this year thing. And then just like still working on crew health and resilience. That's something we want to keep working on as well, just to make sure that, Nick and I for sure, but absolutely our crew is healthy, joyful, and can make it through whatever weather comes our way. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Joan. Are there any specific questions for Joan? And then there are a couple questions that people have put in that apply to all 3 of you, but let's see if there are any specific questions first. All right, if not, we'll ask this question from Heather. And if you do have a specific question for John, feel free to still put it in the chat. And this is a little bit related to Lori's question, but all three of you have had CSAs for a while. Is there anything that you used to grow at all or consecutively, but had to stop growing due to changes in the weather and other climate changes? Or is it just like generally more of a challenge to grow some of the same things?
I would say that we.
Okay. You go ahead,
Sorry.
Jeff.
Okay, I would say some things that it's more varieties of things. We've been doing some broccoli trials, and I can't tell you off the top of my head, but there's certain broccolis that we're getting away from because they're getting more looks like black rot, but it's not really black rot. So there's definitely some varieties of things that we're changing.
We ditched bok choy several years ago mostly for pests. It was always an issue of needing to row cover it for flea beetles. And then when it was just right, and we picked there'd be aphids, and then it would get hot early and then they'd bolt. And I was like, no, never again. And I agree with Jody, we definitely have dropped several varieties of things. And we really are having to dial back on brassicas because of disease issues for one. And then field space for rotation has been a challenge, like having enough room for all the brassicas. And we're cutting back this year more so on some of the early season brassicas that just seem to struggle with our fluctuating weather, temperature, pests. So things like turnips and arugula, even though I love them, we're just dialing back on those right now for early spring because they just continue to be a challenge for us in the early spring. They're easy in the fall, great in the fall, challenging in the spring.
I saw lots of heads nodding as you were talking about spring brassicas. Lauren, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say certain things like we don't grow spring cauliflower. So fewer successions of things that don't do well certain times of year. And then some things that just like for climate reasons are just like our soil, our farm just don't do as well on our farm. We just don't grow. And I think part of that can be part of like I don't know, like both Joan and Jody talked about building that relationship with your customers. So if you can like communicate about the reasons why it's not a great fit for your farm or the reasons why a climate, it's a really good learning opportunity. And people, I think it's a great opportunity to connect with your member base that way.
The elephant in the room on our farm is definitely peas. We really should get rid of them. I'm just struggling to say completely goodbye. And Nick would have said goodbye 10 years ago.
So to Lori's question, you just shared some things that you're maybe getting rid of or thinking about getting rid of because they're not working as well. Are there things that you're shifting towards that do seem to be working better, whether they're perennials or just more broadly things that are working well?
We are trialing sprouting broccoli this year on Anna Racer's suggestion from Waxwing Farm because early like heading broccoli is just a challenge in the spring. So we're not going whole hog on it yet because it's a new crop for us, but that's definitely something that we're trying.
I feel like we try new things each year, but I'm drawing a blank right now. Again, that for the variety thing, just always keeping our eyes and ears up for a variety that might do better in the heat or definitely better in the heat. That's or frost hardy. Those are things we try more often.
We've tried some of the more shelf stable crops, kind of like what Jody was talking about. So we do like popcorn and dry beans and field corn that we grind into cornmeal. And so those they give us a little flexibility for we sometimes put them in our spring share and then they go in our winter share, and it just gives us that little bit of buffer. So that's like, and a lot of times people aren't counting on them. So it's kind of like an extra special treat when they do get them.
A very specific question about beets. Does anyone want to comment on how, do you like to grow beets? Are they doing well for you? Any specific issues?
We do grow beets. We don't have so much of a pest problem with beets. We had like 1 year of leaf miners. Otherwise, they're not too bad of pests. They can just be challenging with heat and sizing up rightly, and germination has been more of a trouble with us, I guess, in the heat for beets. But we did start transplanting beets for a couple of successions several years ago, and it's great for the first succession, just to be a little more like they're more reliable earlier.
We grow beets, very little pest pressure, and we transplant all of ours in just because I don't know if we're not that great at weeding them or what, but it just works a lot better when we transplant them in.
Yeah, we also grow beets. We do sometimes get the, like, I think it's Cercospora, the like leaf spot on beets, which is fine for the roots. If you let them go too long in the field, the tops aren't as nice. So then we just have to top them for storage or just sell them as topped beets. And certain varieties tend to be more susceptible to that than others. Last year we had a heck of a time, and maybe one of you has the answer on this, with like just small rodents. And I don't know if it was just like a predator prey cycle, but we had like mostly prairie voles and meadow voles nibbling like across the board. So they would just go down the row of beets and just like munch the tops. So we would eat them, cut off the eaten part. So we had all the beets, but we didn't have as many as we wanted for our members this year. But yeah, the voles, they got into all of our root crops: winter squash, carrots. They were eating tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. Like an entire eggplant would be hollowed out. It was, so if anyone has thoughts on that, I would love to hear it.
There's a solution in the chat, and it's cats.
I just a week or two ago saw Ray Archuleta talk, and he mentioned with cover cropping that people were, saying that rodents were a problem, and he said a healthy coyote population will take care of that. So if you want to go bigger than cats.
All right, we've got a lot of beet discussion in the chat.
Yeah, so keep the beets up in the chat. So Natalie and I would like to, go ahead, Natalie. You got it, go.
We were going to transition pretty soon here to larger group questions, because in these forums, we know that many of you in the audience also have been thinking about these things and have things to share. Maybe if there's one final question for the panelists. This is a great one, Christina, thank you. So can you reflect a little bit about your personal resilience strategies? So not necessarily farm plans, but just kind of how do you deal with climate anxiety and things like that?
I think one of our personal ways probably, so we do have 2 kids, and I've talked about them before, but honest to goodness, our kids put things in perspective, and they force us to stop working because they have to be fed 3 times a day, every day they had to be fed. And so that means we have to stop working and have dinner. And they're really fantastic at having dance parties, and we go biking with them. And like, it sounds a little silly, but like our kids really have helped us remind us that we can't farm all day, all the time, and climate's always going to be there, and there's always going to be issues. But, if we can put them first, it takes some of that anxiety away as well. Just the joyful part of it.
For me, I would say our kids, I would totally agree. Our community in general, but farming in itself is so therapeutic for me, because I really feel like I'm doing something. I'm doing something to better the soil and better the environment, and I'm growing food for me and other people. And it just gives me the sense of like, this is a huge overwhelming thing, but this is my little part of doing something good within it. So that's mine.
I would say that, like, going through this process, for some reason, even though it seemed like a lot when I wrote down all the ways that the farm could be impacted by climate change, it actually made me feel less anxious about it. Like something about naming it and writing it down made me feel a little more in control. And then personally, I think for me, like I'm outside all the time, but getting outside in a different context. So that's where like with Michael going out on the river, which is like 10 minutes away from us and is right here. And I don't get out as often as I should. But it just like is such an immediate, like different way of interacting with the outdoors, and is a place where I'm not responsible and just like looking at all the things I should be doing and need to do. And or going for a hike, or just like, yeah, even taking the dog to the woods or something like that, is just a reminder that helps ground me when I'm overwhelmed on the farm.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to lift up, I said it at the beginning, but again, what I really appreciated about this process, but again, kind of going back to the way in which we've always interacted with farmers at LSP, is this idea of really focusing in on that holistic goal, which has this really strong quality of life piece. And one thing that this climate resiliency training did, it said, okay, now go back to that. Like, so with all of these things that you just came up with, all the things that the three farmers just shared, like go back to your holistic goal and that quality of life and make sure that those pieces still are in line with that. And I think like that's really also what I've heard farmers say allows them to deal with the stresses, deal with the anxiety, is that they can go back to those quality of life pieces to say like, well, this is what I need to be doing. This is why I want to be doing that. I will say that the process that all these farmers went through did kind of lean them more towards like production specific tweaks for climate change, and a little less so about like, you know, taking a personal vacation or buying a hot tub to soak in when you're done at the end of the day, or like, but we also recognize like those are still really important things to this, maybe the hot tub, well, I guess if it's solar heated, these are also really important things to be thinking about in terms of climate resiliency, is taking care of ourselves and our communities. So I did want to just lift that up as well.
I did have another personal tactic, and I wanted to say, also leaning on your community, even if they're not geographically close. And shout out to Laura, who's also on this call. She's gotten many an email and a text from me like, oh my gosh, what about the frost? And so it's really nice to have other farmers that you can go to and just bounce ideas or concerns off of. And as a very practical thing, I do also have something on my email called a freakout file. And on that freakout file, I make notes about when things go wrong and badly. And then I make sure to reply to them and say, and this is how it turned out. Like the time we thought the early frost wasn't going to come, and we had a wagon full of plants and they all froze, and I thought they all died, and it was our entire succession of brassicas, completely freaked out, and it turns out it was fine. But now I know that, and I can just go to that freakout file. I also have a picture file called a freakout file of all the damage to plants that has happened with bad weather and hail and storms. And when if something happens and I freak out about it, I just go back to that freakout file and I say, but look, this happened and we were okay. So that has been very good to me as someone who has some anxiety. And I had to dip out to go pick up a kid in town. So
thanks so much for being here, John.
Thank you.
So one question that we came up ahead of time that we wanted to pose to the whole group. And Jody and Lauren, you're still totally welcome to weigh in here, but if other folks want to share too, feel free. A lot of people who signed up for these forums are beginning farmers. And so we wanted to ask some of you here with more experience, what might you do differently if you had the opportunity to start from scratch? So for folks who are just getting started in farming, like what advice would you like to give to them? Melissa.
My advice, so when we came to our farm, we decided we didn't want to have debt for the farm. So we just decided to use money from selling our duplex to buy the farm. But to do that, we ended up in probably farther away from people like us, or we're very liberal because we're from South Minneapolis. So we feel pretty isolated socially, politically, I guess you'd say. And I think if I was going to do it again, I would say mortgage is fine. Be closer to people that, closer to a bigger library, closer to people who think like me, closer to a co-op, closer closer to so many things. But that's I would do it a little differently. Yep.
Thank you for sharing that. That is a sentiment that I have heard from many farmers, and maybe something that we don't talk openly about enough. So appreciate you sharing that. Anyone else? Yeah, Lisa.
I guess I just echo what Melissa said. I live in Pierce County, Wisconsin, and I'm also grew up in Madison. So I'm a lifetime liberal and have worked in and out of the Twin Cities for most of my career. So it's been a challenge. The interesting thing was I didn't really know how challenging it was or how different my neighbors were until after the 2016 election. But happily, I'm part of an organization now, a new startup organization in Pierce County called Pierce County Grassroots Organizing. And it has given me a great deal of hope in that we've been doing a lot of one-to-ones with people. And I find that there are many kindred spirits in my neighborhood and throughout the county. We're working now on a soil regeneration project in roadsides in the community. That's our pilot project for our climate environment project. So I would encourage Melissa to hang in there. And I know Kenyon too. Actually, I was married to someone from Kenyon in my former life. And it can be really tough. It can feel really, even I would use the word oppressive to be in a community where you don't feel connected or that kinship socially and politically, but change happens slowly. And I think it's important that we all make an effort to bring some positive and informational ideas to the community, especially as they relate to climate change and what we can do to manage our land to help turn that ship around. So just rambling, some thoughts.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'll just highlight what Nick said here too, that just it's amazing how much shared values we can have. And I share some of those sentiments. I live in a place where maybe don't have on the surface a lot in common with a lot of my neighbors, but I've taken a lot of inspiration from Jody and some of the ways that she's built community with people around her who maybe wouldn't be immediate connections. But she's done a really great job of that. Laura, you had something to share too, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one thing I've been reflecting on kind of in the past 5 years is a change in thinking is that there's just kind of no one right way to grow your farm. So what I heard a lot when we were starting out was like, you start small, you direct market, and then you scale up, right? And how can we like scale up our farms and like serve more markets? And at a certain point, that just doesn't work for everybody. And there's like a million different ways to do this. And it's a journey. So like, the goal setting process and really figuring out what works for you is important, even if it's a tiny farm or if you want to have a huge 100-acre farm. There's just no right way. You just got to figure out what works for you.
Thanks, Laura, for lifting that up. I will say, like, as a farm beginnings facilitator for the past 13 years, we've been able to like adapt into that sentiment also. I think we were guilty early on of really pushing for financially independent farms that could make all sole income from the farms was like the level of success. And I think we utilized a lot of farmers that had gotten to that level as mentors and as things to strive for. And I'm not saying that that's not like still a great thing, but I think we might have done slight disservice in lifting that up as like the gold standard. Whereas what Laura's saying, there's so many ways to do this. If we really want to mitigate climate change and we really want to build healthier communities, we need people growing food in every which way that you can imagine, and not just folks, you know, running both people are farming full time and all their income's coming from the farm. Like, again, that's part of the puzzle, but highlighting, and I think we've done a much better job with that within Farm Beginnings in the last few years to like highlight, hey, whatever works for you, great. However we can support you, great, because we need you. The food system needs you, and there are different ways to go about doing that. So that's been a really good realization. So Laura, I appreciate you lifting that up.
All right. Well, it's great to just see like we're emphasizing the importance of community in climate resilience, and that seems to be what all of you are bringing forth as well. So that's great. We did say we would make some time for Laura to share some information about this drought bill. So we're already 8:24. So why don't we do that right now?
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay, perfect. My name is Laura Schreiber. I'm on LSP's policy team and have been working on our state policy work, and have an exciting update for the Minnesota House drought relief package actually passed like an hour and a half ago, which is really, really exciting to see moving forward. So just actually, could I share a screen? Because I have a little slide so I can break it down for folks. Or I might already have it. Okay, now we're good. Let's see. Okay, so to break this down for everyone, so there's 10 million in total. There's going to be 5.1 million for direct payments for specialty crop and livestock.
Your slideshow disappeared.
Oh no. Okay, hang on. Is it back?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I couldn't find my mute button.
Okay, I'm using dual monitors, so we're a little messed up here. Okay. All right, so 10 million total, and there's 5.1 million for direct payments for specialty crop and livestock producers, and then 5 million for the Rural Finance Authority disaster recovery loans. And in the House version, there was language that was changing the eligibility requirements around those loans from 50% of your income coming from farming to 20%. So trying to make that more accessible to, you know, new and beginning farmers, especially. Some examples of the costs that would be eligible for those direct rapid relief grants include water handling equipment, such as water tanks, pipeline, water wagons, water hauling, irrigation, wells, but really purchases that you have receipts for. MDA is going to require seeing receipts for those purchases. So if you have, for example, like increased labor is on the table of a potential expense that could be covered, but you need to have timesheets for that. So just thinking about what are the purchases that you have receipts for, because then you can get that reimbursed for drought relief related expenses. So,
hey Laura, is it 5.1 or 1.5?
5.1 for the House version.
Okay.
Yeah. And I can triple check, but I was looking at the language just recently. So yeah, 5.1 for the direct payments. And then they've set aside $1 million for specialty crop, $1 million for livestock, and then 500,000 for market farmers. And then whatever monies is left, they will redisperse for those in need. So Senate side though, they passed their version of the drought relief package on Wednesday, and it's a little different than the House. There's more money going toward livestock producers. So the next step for that bill is it's actually moving to the Senate Finance Committee. So we won't be able to pass these funds until both House and Senate come together to agree on one version of this bill. So I was thinking it'd be great if folks have a moment, and those Minnesota-based, Wisconsin folks, but calling Julie Rosen, who is the chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate. So that's where that package will move next. but calling her to ask for that relief package to be heard so we can continue to move this forward. So we can have both House and Senate come together to create one version of this and then get those fundings out to farmers. So I have a sample script for people if you use it if you'd like. But hi, my name is calling from Share Your Farm and urging you to hear the Senate drought relief package and move this forward to ensure these funds can reach farmers and maybe share a story of how the drought impacted your farm. So I'm going to stop, or actually, no, I'll just drop this number in the chat. That might be easier for people too, but yeah, if we could all take even just 1 minute here and call their offices, that'll make a huge difference of speeding up this timeline and getting these proposals moved forward. But any questions from folks?
Hey, Laura, could you copy that whole message and just throw that in the chat too, so folks have that?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. And can folks call tonight, or should they call in the morning?
They can call tonight. You can call right now, because they most likely will not answer tomorrow. But if you want to wait until tomorrow, you can kind of space out the ask. That works too. But as long as this is in front of you, we could perfectly fine to do it right now too.
Thank you, Laura, for lifting that up. Thank you to everyone who's been working on that as well, both the farmers who have been sharing their stories and also those of you on the policy team and others who have been working to push that forward. Really appreciate it. All right, look at the time. So I am going to, Freya wanted to know when we were done. I told her right now. But before we wrap up, I just want to thank Jody and Joan and Lauren for sharing with us tonight. I want to thank Natalie and Annalee and for co-facilitating. Laura, thanks for sharing the update on the bills. And then just a couple quick last minute things. Annalee put a eval in the chat. It's really helpful. It's really, really short, like 3 questions. It's really, really helpful for us to kind of capture some of that. This has been grant funded. These forums have been grant funded by risk management, and part of our grant is to report back. So that's really helpful for us. And then just so you know what's coming, we are wanting to keep this climate work moving forward. Climate change is going nowhere. We need more resilient farms. We need more resilient communities. So we're going to continue down these paths. We're not exactly sure what some of the next steps are, but we're going to be doing one-to-ones and meeting with farmers to talk a little bit about some next steps. But part of what we want to do is think about starting some regional climate hubs. So getting regional farmers together, because we've realized that, like Natalie said at the beginning, we could live really close to each other, like in Minnesota, but we are experiencing different things in different regions just based on where we live. So stay tuned for some additional climate change hub work that will probably be happening in the fall. And then please just feel free to reach out to Natalie, Annalee, or myself if you have questions or other things that are coming up. Or Laura and Sean from LSP's policy team are here as well. Reach out to them if you have questions. But stay tuned, because we're going to be having more climate work coming up in the very near future. So Natalie, did you want to say anything else before we head out?
No, I think that was a good summary. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks
time to write hi in the chat. Thank you everyone for showing up tonight. Really nice to see everybody, and we will be seeing you all hopefully very soon.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.
Now go for it.
Hi, Freya.
Chris and Ashley were here too. They just hopped off. Did you see them? Do you need help? Freya needs help. Natalie and with the toothpaste. Natalie and Annalee, nice to see you. Bob, nice to see you as well.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
We'll debrief next week, but
Good.
Good job. We did it.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good night, y'all.
Okay. Bye-bye. Oh, I'm going to save chat.